to our Wednesday night class for this week. Jim Morgan, Aaron Tremblay here, coming to you to continue our Bible class on the life and times of Joseph from the book of Genesis. And at the beginning of our class this week, we wanted to take an opportunity to answer a couple of questions that were sent in, so we'll take a little bit of time to do that. I will mention and extend an invitation to anyone who wants to send additional questions. We're very open to it, happy to answer them, take time to discuss the various ideas you have regarding the text. And our first question that we had this week was from chapter 40. And in chapter 40, there's a discussion regarding what hanging means.
Mm-hmm. How did the baker die?
How did the baker die? Exactly. And in the ESV text, which was one of the texts we read from last week, it uses the phrase hanging. Mm-hmm. In the NIV 1984, it uses the word impaled, but it has a footnote.
Well, no, it talks about hanging, but the footnote is impaled.
Okay, the footnote specifies impaled, and actually, if you look at different translations, there are some that use those terms interchangeably, even though in our minds, when we think of hanging, typically we're thinking about the West.
A noose
around the neck, and the little, what do they call that? The trap door the guy falls through, and you'll hang by your neck until dead.
Till you're
right?
dead, yeah.
But when the Bible talks about hanging, as you look throughout the Old Testament, there are instances of people being impaled and they're left. What it's talking about when it talks about hanging is they're displayed. Mm-hmm. In other words, if it's an evil king that's defeated and they kill him and then they hang him as a demonstration of, he lost.
Yeah.
And this is a warning to everybody else.
Saul and his sons were hung on the wall.
That's right.
It was considered to be the ultimate insult.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not buried, then your soul can't go on to rest, and it goes on. There's a Greek play where a sister goes out. Her brothers have been left out there, and the king tells them, there's no way that anybody's going to bury him. We're just going to leave him there. And she goes out and sprinkles dirt on him and ends up paying the price for it. But it's considered the ultimate insult to refuse burial to someone.
And we know that burial places were significant in the Bible, too, because there's places where we have evil kings, and we're not told where they're buried. But when they're good kings, they were buried with their fathers in the Valley of the Kings, So,
and some of the kings, it says, and he wasn't buried in this place because he's a bad king.
Correct. And the second part of this that we take into consideration is it uses this phrase, he lifted up his head. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about lifting up somebody's head, we typically are going to think of your head being removed, decapitated. Right?
And the NIV says in verse 19, it says, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head. Mm-hmm. So, that is a possibility.
Yeah, and so the key to all this is whether he was impaled or hung by a tree or whatever method that was used to kill him was exactly in line with what Joseph predicts. Mm-hmm. And Joseph knows that fact, and the baker knows that fact, because when he goes to Pharaoh, he says in chapter 41, which is where we'll be this week, he said, he interpreted each one of our individual dreams, and both of them happened just like he said.
Yeah.
And he mentions the hanging there.
Yeah. And the purpose for hanging the body is so that the birds and animals will come along to eat it, and that's what it says. And the birds will eat away your flesh. Mm-hmm. So there's possibility that all of those happened. Mm-hmm. That his head was cut off, he was impaled or hung, and then the birds came and ate his flesh. So right. Whatever it was that the baker had done, the king, Pharaoh, was not happy with it. Which leads into the second question.
Yes. And the second question was, why is it that one of the two prisoners that's brought up from the prison, why is it that the baker is killed and the cupbearer is given amnesty? He's forgiven, and he returns to exactly where he was before.
Yeah. And what you told me was interesting, because I had never thought of this before. But
yeah, one of the articles I looked at over this past week was from the Biblical Archaeological Review, and you can find them online. They have a website, and they also have magazines that they put out that you can read. But I was doing some research, and what I found out, which was really interesting, and then come to find out even in the ESV footnotes, it talks about this idea that more than likely when it mentions this birthday of Pharaoh, it's not talking about the actual day when he was physically born, when he came into the world. What it's talking about is his birthday as a god. In other words, when he ascends to the throne, when he goes from being a son of Pharaoh to the Pharaoh, he goes from being simply man to divine. Mm-hmm. And so on this day, to mark this special occasion, which they always remembered each year, one of their traditions in the Egyptian culture was very similar to the Roman tradition that we find with Jesus and Barabbas, where you'd bring these two people up from the prison, and one of them would be condemned, and one of them would be freed. And so it's a very similar situation here. Now, we're not told specifically why does he pick a cupbearer over a baker, but we have documented history of a tradition there in Egypt of two prisoners being brought forth, and one being forgiven and the other being condemned. So likely that's what's being demonstrated here. You know, did he just like the cupbearer or hate the cupbearer a little less than the baker? I mean, it's hard to know. You probably wouldn't have, though, a much more committed cupbearer than one that you took out of the prison and forgave everything. And
and we were talking about that. That might be the reason why he never gets around to mentioning this to Pharaoh. Yeah. Because if he was guilty, but he had been pardoned, he's not really going to want to bring that up again with Pharaoh if he can help it.
Sure.
And so, yeah, that may be one of the reasons why he was a little bit hesitant. And then after a while, it just got to be a habit. And then finally, he just kind of, well, you know, it's too late anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
So
it kind of
good questions.
Passes over it. Yeah, we really appreciate the questions, and it got me to thinking, and made me want to dig into it some more.
Yeah.
To have a better understanding, and so your questions actually, as much as our answers hopefully help you, helps us too.
Very much.
To dig some more into the
text.
And
if I could add, it looks like if what our elders are planning is going to come, it looks like we may be doing this for a while. So if you've got a subject that you would like for us to cover in more depth than just a question, send it in to us. Let us consider it. Maybe we can take it up and we can spend some weeks possibly figuring out what's going on with it.
Yeah. So we'll be in chapter 41 this week. We're continuing the story of Joseph. We left off with verse 23, which I think is pretty critical. Joseph interprets the dreams. Both the dreams are fulfilled, but the one thing that's not fulfilled from chapter 40 going to chapter 41 is Joseph's request. Mm-hmm. Remember me. And the text is specific to let us know that even though Joseph makes that request, the cupbearer does ultimately forget him.
And I think that what's going on here is that if Joseph had been released from the prison, he would probably have just gone back home.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, he wouldn't have been there when Pharaoh needed an interpretation. He wouldn't have been there to save all of the grain. Millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people, whatever, all across the world would have died. And so in this case, it didn't fulfill God's plans to save people for Joseph to be released. When he's released, it's to go right into a place where he can be used to help people.
That's right, and make a huge difference.
Big difference.
So a part of God's plan. So in 41, it specifies to us, so we leave 40 and we know he's been forgotten. And starting in 41, it specifies that it's after 2 whole years. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. So again, we've spent a little bit of time on this, just talking about the idea of 2 whole years is a long amount of time to be stuck in prison when you know you don't deserve to be there in the first place, number one. Number two, you help somebody in a huge way, and now they're not helping you back. And you talked about, I think last time, every time that door opens to the cell, you're like, oh, they remembered me. Oh, no, they didn't. You know, or every time you pick up your cup, you're like, hey, remember when I helped that cup there? You know?
Disappointment after disappointment after disappointment.
Right. So 2 years, when it says a whole 2 years, we're talking about a whole lot of disappointment, of being forgotten. Pharaoh's given this dream, and we know that's something that God is doing. Verse 2 says, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke.
It's easy to see why you would wake up after that. That's an image
a weird
that's just
dream.
disgusting.
Yeah, cow cannibalism, and although I like this world where the plump ones are the attractive ones. Something about that. Just I like that. But
we won't go there.
No, but we look at this dream that he's having, and here's something I think that's important when we look at their culture. The gods were in charge of the livestock. The gods were in charge of the food and the rain and how fertile the ground was going to be. And Pharaoh was included in that. when things would go bad or when something was weird or awry with the livestock, it had implications of a problem with the gods.
Yeah, you look at the 10 plagues later, and it's surprising how many of them are directed at agriculture and horticulture.
Correct. And so when we see this as Pharaoh, as for all intents and purposes, one of the gods, he sees this weird thing happening where, number one, cows aren't supposed to be eating each other.
No.
And number two, certainly you wouldn't expect for the smaller, kind of decrepit cows to eat the 7 large, healthy cows. We kind of expect if there's cows that are malnourished and unhealthy that they would die off and not become the one who follows through.
And cows are not noted for eating meat to start with.
Correct. So this is a very strange dream on a lot of levels for a Pharaoh who is supposedly divine. You want to read the second one?
Yeah. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk, and after them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind, and the thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads, and then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. Now you talk about really strange.
Yeah.
Corn eating corn.
Corn eating corn. Again, we look at the divine part of this. The weather's not cooperating, right? The strong east wind.
Mm-hmm.
Something is awry with the gods. Something is awry with how things are supposed to be working. This is counter to how nature is supposed to work, right?
Yeah.
So,
the animals are not acting right, and agriculture is not acting right.
Creation gone into chaos,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a problem with the gods. And so Pharaoh, again, he wakes up and he's like, I mean, he's probably sweating bullets. Whoa, I'm glad that was a dream, but what in the world?
Yeah,
what's happening?
What does that mean?
And now he doesn't want to go back to sleep until he finds out what it means, right?
And the second dream is probably the one that's even more disturbing to him because of the Nile.
Yes.
If you remember, Egypt, the only reason that Egypt has any agriculture at all is because the Nile floods, leaves rich soil on the banks as it goes down, and that's where they plant and grow things.
That's right.
And if anything is messing with that, then Egypt is in a lot of trouble.
And your point is actually verified in the text because in verse 1 it specifies his location, right? Yeah. It says he's dreaming,
Standing
which we know that, but he's standing by the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the source of, again, for all intents and purposes, life in Egypt.
Yeah,
the Nile shuts down, Egypt shuts down.
Egypt shut down. Well, that's why later on there's going to be a famine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not to give away the end of the story. But the Nile is the chief god of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Everything depends on the Nile, and without the Nile, Egypt is nothing. And that's the reason why, again, when you get over to the 10 plagues, the first thing that struck is the Nile, because it says they can go by the banks of the river and drill wells, and they got water.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Nile itself. The river of life has become the river of death.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a direct strike at the chief god of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, so it's an important point that's here in the text, and like I said, going back to verse 1, you can see that connection, and actually it's mentioned again at the end of verse 3 on the bank of the Nile.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. The Nile is weaved into this, and it plays an important role. So then we get to verse 8, and it says, so in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. So he's drawing in the best of the best when it comes to
the all-star squad.
The all-star squad, that's right, the A-team. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now,
and go ahead.
I was just going to say, when he draws all these guys together, this is their moment to shine.
Mm-hmm.
If you could be the guy to interpret these dreams when everyone else failed, you are going to get elevated drastically. So if you think you even have a chance, you're going to try and give what you have.
Plus, it's your job.
Right.
You know, can you not do your job? But I would like to point out, we were talking about this beforehand, but we tend to think of this kind of thing in the Bible, these magicians, as being some kind of tricksters.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that these guys don't try to pass off some interpretation, you know, to tell Pharaoh this is what it means. They just flat out admit, look, we can't do this one. Which means that whatever power it's coming by, they know in past they've been right, but this is beyond their power. This is not a trick. This is not some kind of gimmick that they use, but instead this is actual. They've been using actual supernatural power. But in the Bible, there's two places where miraculous power or supernatural power can come from. One is God, and the other is Satan. You know, later on, again, going back to the magicians, when Moses goes in, it says, and the magicians do the same thing.
That's right.
Now, there comes a point where they can't do it anymore because God's not going to let them go that far. But all the way through the Bible, these people are doing these things, and it's real. You know, what's the penalty for being a sorceress or a wizard in the Old Testament? Death.
Yeah.
Well, you know, for card tricks, that's a pretty harsh sentence.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you go over into the New Testament, and, you know, when you get to the book of Revelation, it says that Satan allows the beast to do the same things that God's people do. So there is a theme that goes all the way through, that the miraculous power can come from God or it can come from Satan. And in Deuteronomy, it talks about that if a prophet comes and he tells you something, makes a prediction, and it comes true, but then he says, now let's go worship another god, he says, you don't pay any attention to him. Matter of fact, you put him to death.
That's right.
So the miracle is not proof. It's a way to say you need to pay attention to this because something's going on here, but it's the content of the message that determines whether or not this person is from God. And I think that's important as you go through, especially today, you know, when people claim to be working miraculous powers, that it's not whether or not they can do that, and I would deny it.
Right.
It's not whether they can do it, it's what's their message. And if it's not biblical, then wherever that power came from, or whatever it is, it's not from God.
It's like James says, test the spirits.
Test the spirits.
To see if they're from God.
Yeah.
And I think...
And Paul talks about counterfeit miracles. Well, how do you tell something's a counterfeit? You compare it to the true.
That's right. And I think it's maybe just that word to us, magician, evokes David Copperfield or whatever, pulling a rabbit out of a hat and those kind of things. And we have to remember, in Egyptian culture, even later on actually in the New Testament, we talk about the Magi, those kind of people, interpreting astrological signs, doing these kind of things, was something that wasn't considered to be just like an academic practice. It was considered to be able to interpret. You're dealing with the cosmos, the things of the gods, when you're dealing with these astrological signs and all that kind of stuff had a lot of meaning to them. Yeah. And so those were some of the things I think that they did too.
Yeah. And that's the reason why the penalty is so harsh, is because these people are dealing with demons. And people of God do not deal with demonic powers except to cast them out and send them back to where they belong.
Right. You have instances of the witch of Endor. You have some things in the Old Testament. They're kind of some hard things to deal with to a certain extent, but in the context of what you're talking about, of something, whether it's from God or not, you know, we wouldn't typically think of the witch of Endor being able to happen apart from God, but it does, and then it's condemned for happening, right? Yeah. And actually comes with quite a cost to solve, right? And Samuel's not like, "Whoa, I'm glad to be here." He's like,
I'm
what
back.
Are you doing? So I think it's a great point to make in terms of, you know, we read that term magician, and I think we instantly trivialize, you know, these guys were just waving around sticks or something, you know, but they had a place among the upper echelon of Egypt for certain. And the wise men, we talk about wise men, we're talking about some people that demand some respect and have some clout in Egypt. So Pharaoh surrounds himself with all these guys, and the key is here at the end of this verse that nobody can interpret it. Yeah. So he's consulted everyone. There's no answer to the situation. Again, there's motivation to answer, because this could be the difference for this is like winning the lottery if you could, for his men. I mean, it's going to set you apart from everyone else.
Yeah, it shows up everybody else. I guess we know now who's the wise man.
Right. And so
the dude.
We know if they could give an answer, they certainly would have. I mean, for sure.
And I just think it's interesting that they said, we don't know.
That's right.
Instead of trying to, you know, bluff their way through or use some gimmick, we don't know.
Right.
This has never happened before.
So verse 9 says, Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. Now, I like that. I think that's got a little spoon of humility with it. You know, he doesn't have to state that he forgot. He doesn't have to admit to that part, but he does. He doesn't say, I remember Joseph today. He says, oh, man, I remember.
Yeah. I like the NIV. It says, today I am reminded of my shortcomings.
Yes. And 2 years worth of shortcomings. And Joseph hasn't forgotten about the shortcomings.
No, he's not.
So verse 10, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants. Now, I don't know if I would have gone there. You know, hey, remember when you got really mad at me? You know, but he
of course
does.
he thinks now if he can connect himself with Joseph,
and Joseph pulls through
and does it. This is going to be good.
Good point. Angry with his servants, and put me and the chief baker into custody in the house. Here's his phrase again. Of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. So again, not just one dream, 2 dreams, each of them being different. Verse 12, and a young Hebrew. So notice, we talk about controversial, we talk about there being tension. Egyptians and the Hebrews did not click together at all. And actually, we talked about, I think, maybe not last week, but the week before, how far back that went all the way to Abraham and Sarah with Hagar. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged.
And I think that verse 13 in the NIV, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. Not just in a vague way, not, some way he made a connection. Exactly. Because that's what Pharaoh was looking for. These are, as you pointed out, these are connected with the gods. What is going on here? And he's going to want to know this guy can tell exactly what it means.
And nobody could have known. I mean, if we were going back to the question we already answered about, okay, how come one gets forgiven, the other doesn't? It's Pharaoh's, basically, happy ascension day to Pharaoh. Nobody alive in Egypt knows who he's going to pick. Because it's not like the mob thing that went on with Jesus, where, who do you want? Pharaoh's going to make the choice. He's the God, and this is the plea. It's like a sacrifice to him, kind of. Nobody knew who Pharaoh would pick except Pharaoh. But Joseph picks correctly. And not just pick them, but how they would be killed. So, again, this is significant. Verse 13 is telling us, here's the difference. All the other guys said, nope, we can't do it. And Joseph's already done it before. So then we get into 14 and following, and we're going to have Joseph come into the picture. You want to pick up there?
So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And when he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Now, the shaving is what we were talking about before.
Yeah, and there's pretty big significance to this, or potentially to this shaving. When I used to read that, I always just thought to myself, he's just cleaning up a little bit. He'd been in prison a while, he got a little stink, I probably need to clean up. And we think...
Which is true.
Right, which is true. He was running the prison, but still. We think today of shaving as kind of a way of, I hate to admit it for obvious reasons, but for cleaning up, we say you clean up well or something. I usually mean someone's well dressed and all those kind of things. And but shaving was different in Egyptian culture. It didn't necessarily have to do with just grooming. Everyone in Egypt was shaved. You wouldn't walk around and see someone with a beard in Egypt. It's just not going to happen if they're Egyptian.
At various times in Egyptian history, even women would shave their head and wear a wig.
That's right. And it had a lot to do with their culture. They were very serious about hair and, well, I guess just hair or lack of hair. To the point where if you were balding, they had ways to give you hair. If you were graying, they would dye your hair. If the look was black hair, very well kept, and a clean-shaven face. That's Egyptian. So when we see Hebrews or other nations around them interacting, most of those people had beards. And so part of it probably has to do with trying to maybe fit in, if that's a good way to say it. But one of the really interesting things in Egypt was the priests, those who had direct dealing with the gods, were to shave themselves completely. And that was their way of being as pure as possible, without blemish, to be able to enter into the holy places. And sure enough, Joseph is entering into, now, hear what I'm saying here, an Egyptian holy place, okay? He's going into the throne room of one of their gods, and that is Pharaoh. And so part of the indication here could be when he shaves himself is that he's purifying himself in order to be able to appear.
Or they're purifying him.
Correct, to be able to appear before Pharaoh.
Egyptian system.
And so I think that's important to note here in terms of the culture and what's going on. And And by the way, I think part of the reason why Joseph's brothers don't recognize him later on is because they wouldn't have thought of Joseph as being someone who was clean shaven.
Yeah.
But he kind
Last time they saw him, he had a beard.
That's right. So just some interesting points I think that are helpful there to take into consideration. There's a spiritual element to this story before we even get into Joseph's declaration of who's going to interpret. Go ahead and keep going with 15.
It says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, again, here's your chance. And, you know, the cupbearer's over here. Go for it.
please get this right.
Get this right. And remember, I brought you here.
Yeah.
But he says, and in verse 16, the cupbearer must have swallowed his tongue. He says, I cannot do it. Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires.
And let's remember, too, that so far Joseph's interpretations, right or wrong, have not turned out well.
No.
They got him thrown into prison. They got him left in prison. So he's being called out again to use God's gifts. And I think there's a valid point talking about courage and faith. Every time he's used this gift that God has given him has not turned out well.
Yeah.
And for me, I'd be like, maybe this wasn't really God's gift to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, he messed up the one when I was back at Daddy's house. Still hadn't figured out what that one was all about. Got one guy killed. Other guy got off even though he was guilty. This is just not really worked out. But he says, God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. At a time when it would have really suited him, his purposes to have elevated himself, he still says, no, it's God who does this.
Absolutely.
It's God who does this. So he says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, and I love this one. This is where I really like Pharaoh, because I love the way he describes this. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. When out of the river, there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. This is where I like it. After them, 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. And the lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. And then I woke up. So, you know, here's the first dream. The ugly cows, the sleek and fat cows, cows eating cows. Something's going on here. What is this?
The world's backwards.
Yeah. So I'll let you pick up the agriculture.
So then in 22 he says, I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good, 7 ears withered and thin and blighted by the east wind sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears, and I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. And I'd imagine at this point when Pharaoh has a Hebrew prisoner in front of him to interpret these dreams, he's expressing a little frustration.
Yeah.
No one. He says it several times.
Yeah.
Nobody could do it.
Nobody can do it. And again, it's interesting that apparently Pharaoh recognizes there is a significance to these dreams. There's something here that I need to find out.
I need to know.
Yeah, otherwise he wouldn't have brought in the all-star team, the A-team. He needs to know this. The gods are trying to tell him something. And if one of the others had actually, you know, managed to do this, demonic power or whatever, so much of history would have changed. Because this is where the Egyptians first learn about the power of God. And then later on they're going to ignore the power of God again. And everything, all of the food and the animals that were given here are going to be wiped out. So you can't go back later and say, okay, now we don't need you. Even 400 and something years later.
It's true. God
will make sure that you're either rewarded or punished depending on how you treat him.
And Joseph makes a key decision in that statement we looked at earlier, where he humbles himself and gives God the glory. Right? He's not worried about I gotta look out for Joseph now and just say, oh, this is it. This is what the dream. No, I can't do it. I'm just like these guys. I can't do it, but God can do it, and relies then on God to be the one who elevates him in whatever way He will. But make sure that God gets the credit. And I think that's critical as we look at the story as well.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of how it turns out. And Joseph easily could have got thrown back into prison. You know, could have gone a lot of different ways.
Okay, thank you. We're out of here.
Exactly. So 25 says, Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. So he had two dreams, but he's saying it's the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. I just want to mention this real quick too. The cupbearer and the baker, one's a good dream, quote unquote, right? You get restored, everything's going to go well. One's a bad dream, you're going to die. Sorry, right? But Pharaoh's dream, it's good and bad, right?
Yeah.
This is not necessarily an easy easy interpretation to give to Pharaoh. You're telling him 7 years of his reign are going to be garbage. I mean, now he's going to tell him that you can make some preparations, but for 7 years it's going to be this huge. I mean, that's rough news to get, right? As somebody that's a leader of a people.
As it turns out, what could have been garbage if they'd unprepared for those 7 years,
without the interpretation,
it turns into the best thing that ever happens to Pharaoh, because at the beginning of it, Pharaoh basically is a very minor person. He doesn't have very much power. He does, but by the end of it, he owns all of the land, he owns all of the buildings, he owns all of the people, he owns all of the livestock. God is really going to do him a favor here. Mm-hmm. And so those 7 lean years, when you depend on God, actually, if you're preparing for it, can turn out to be a pretty good thing.
Yeah, he's going to be blessed in the midst of it.
Yeah.
But a hard interpretation to present to a demigod. So the 7 good cows are 7 good years. The 7 good ears are 7 good years. The dreams are 1. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. So this is the positive side of it, looking at the blessing that God's going to bring about in these first 7. Mm-hmm. But after them will arise a severe famine, 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. I think that's a pretty interesting statement that he makes.
Yeah.
That it's going to be so bad that nobody's even going to remember any of the good stuff. And I think there's a whole principle there in terms of how much difficulty does it take us to forget a lifetime of provision or blessing when it comes to God. When we're struggling with things, it's like when we get into that moment, it's so easy for us to forget. And you see it with God's people all the time, how quick that doubting sets in. Things get a little hard, and they're like, I mean, look at his people, and they cross the Red Sea, and they don't have cucumbers and melons, and they're like, forget it, that's it, let's go back. He brought us here to die,
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible how fast we can forget. You were blessed for 7 years. How quick they're just it's like it never even happened. Yeah, but we're suffering now, so what difference does that make,
And you suspect that during that 7 years of plenty, they grumbled. When they came around to collect 20% of their crop, man, they grumbled and grumbled and taxes. And so,
good point. Yeah.
It's just, And the other thing is that when you have that 7 years of plenty, you just kind of assume that's the way it's always going to be. Mm-hmm. We're going through that now with the coronavirus. Everybody just assumed the economy is going to continue to roar, unemployment's going to remain low, everybody's raises, wages are going to keep going up, and all of a sudden, within a period of a couple of weeks, boom!
Yeah,
it was all gone. And it can, it's going to take a while to get it back.
And here's the interesting thing to me with this too, as we're talking about this. If Joseph gives this interpretation and Pharaoh doesn't listen to it, and just says, I'm just going to enjoy. Things are going great. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not worried about.
Many economies in good shape.
And then when he gets to the point that they're all starving to death, who's he going to point the finger at? I mean, he might say, well, why is God doing this and all that? But really it comes back to, well, God tried to give you an opportunity to, and so I just think there's a lot of teachings in here in terms of dealing with hard times and struggles, suffering and those kind of things. When you look at, as soon as this stuff comes, as soon as the famine comes, people are going to forget all 7 years of plenty.
Yeah. And, looking at it, for those of you who may be watching this, most of you probably know, but I spent 40 years as a preacher. And, the preacher arrives, you don't have to listen to this, but the preacher arrives and, man, everything's going good, everything's going to keep going good. And then as soon as something goes bad, something goes wrong, a mistake is made, boom, that wipes out everything. So, you've got to learn that all of life is not the years of abundance. Sometimes you're going to hit the year of famine.
Sure.
And a church needs to learn how to hold together. In the years of plenty, it's easy. But when things are tough, church needs to learn how to hold together.
That's
we need each other more than that. And that means that we can't spend time picking over old wounds and, if this and this and this and this. You use the period of good to get ready for the times of bad.
Well, Paul's whole elaboration in Philippians shows us that faith can never be attached to circumstance.
Yeah.
Just because your circumstance is famine doesn't mean your faith is going to be famine.
Mm-hmm.
You can't let that happen. You can't be someone who worships, celebrates, turns to God only when things are going good. You'll acknowledge Him. You'll do, everything you can to live like. But then when it goes bad, if my life is famine, then my faith is famine. If my life is feast, then my faith is feast.
Yeah.
And Paul says it doesn't matter what I've seen both sides. Whatever circumstance I'm in, it's irrelevant. My relationship with God is going to maintain and be steadfast.
Mm-hmm. And that no matter how bad things are, you can find something good out of it.
Sure. But if you choose in the years of plenty or feast to just say, well, I got what I need. I don't really need God. And let's be honest, going back to Deuteronomy chapter 8, and I keep going back to that, but man,
it's a great chapter.
It's a great chapter,
right?
I mean, it's like the years of plenty. That's when you have to be investing yourself in your faith and building your faith up, because all of us know that hard times are going to come in life, whether it's coronavirus or death of a loved one, or we all have struggles and challenges. But if you wait until the hard times to say, okay, now I need God, man, that makes it so much harder.
Well, the prodigal son.
Sure, yeah.
As long as he's got all the money, he's got all the friends he needs and everything. Let the good times roll. He lived in New Orleans, but but then all of a sudden he runs out of money. The bad times have arrived, and he discovers, man, I need to go home.
And how much harder is it for him to go through that process of loss, then the humiliation of going back to the Father and thinking that his whole life is just going to amount to being a servant in his Father's house, as opposed to, I'm going to enjoy these years of time with my Father and being pleasing to Him. And, He makes his life a lot harder than it had to be, and
then there's the older brother who just makes any time miserable.
Yeah, he
didn't enjoy it when the kid was gone. He doesn't enjoy it when the kid's back. He's just not going to be happy.
He's faithful, but he's
only
one of the people.
Technical definition of the word.
He's one of the people I talk about. He looks at everything God says as the have-tos and not the get-tos.
Yeah.
Look at me and what I have to do.
Yeah.
It's rough.
What I love about that is when he says, "You never gave me a calf." Well, don't you have some of your own? Well, I'm not using mine.
Exactly. So, I just think there's a principle here that's helps me to keep things in perspective.
Oh, yeah.
All the plenty will be forgotten once the years of famine come.
There's not a time that you don't have to be getting ready for when times are rough. Mm-hmm. So then in verse 28, it is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. 7 years of famine will follow them. All the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. Then picking up in verse 31, the abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon.
And I think there's a good principle there for when we read the Bible and are looking at what the text means. There's a lot of times where phrases are repeated in the Old and New Testament, and it's usually that's the whole reason it's repeated.
Yeah.
Rejoice in the Lord always, and again, I say rejoice, right? Mm-hmm. And those Psalms where it's and the steadfast love of the Lord and the steadfast love of the Lord. So I think this is helpful. It's kind of an elementary principle, but it's helpful when things are repeated in Scripture. Pay attention.
Yeah. Well, back in the Pentateuch, it says, at the mouth of one witness, that doesn't prove anything. But two is a different story. Well, okay, we got two here then. Two dreams mean exactly the same thing.
So guess what? If there's 4 Gospels, what does that tell you? Pay attention.
Yeah.
This is pretty important.
Yeah. Well, any school teacher will tell you that the secret to learning is repetition, repetition,
That's
repetition.
Right. I love in Peter, it's the best verse for a preacher when he says, I won't hesitate to remind you of these things.
Yeah.
I'll say this more than once.
Yeah, I remember the story about a preacher that, you know, every time he got up, he'd talk about the same thing. And the people came to him and said, look, when are you going to start preaching on something new? He says, when you get this one right, I'll go on to something else.
That's right. Yeah. So we have the severe famine, the land's being consumed, the repetition part in 32, and then we have 33.
And then 33, where Joseph starts campaigning for a job, I think. And now, let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. And this food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. And the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all of his officials. So now Pharaoh's looking around, wonder who we can put in charge of this. Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man? One in whom is the Spirit of God? And there is a footnote in the NIV, one in whom is the Spirit of the gods.
One of the gods.
Yeah, so, you know, Pharaoh doesn't just all of a sudden instantly convert. But
they're still using that word Elohim for,
yeah,
which can be
general.
plural for gods, and not Yahweh. No.
Yeah, it's not the covenant, because the covenant hasn't been established.
Correct.
Really. But I think that Pharaoh recognizes, and that's the beauty of Pharaoh. He recognizes that what Joseph says makes perfect sense, and it doesn't have to be his idea.
Well, and Joseph's made it kind of easy for him, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I think you should find a wise man. He's looking around the room at all these.
All the ones
none of
that
those
couldn't
guys
do
are
it.
talking. You know, if only there was a wise man.
And then he comes up with his brilliant plan.
Yeah, yeah.
Because, you know, we know the end of the story, and you got to imagine that as that first year goes along, they come and collect 20%. But you have to remember that in 7 years, they produce enough food that the entire world can be fed for 7 years. So maybe losing 20% of a crop that big is not going to be a big deal.
And now we see part of God's plan, I think, unfolding. Joseph was in charge of the house of the captain of the guard, Potiphar's house, then the prison. He's learned these administrative skills, preparation.
Administrative skills.
And so now, like, if he was 17 and gets thrown in front of Pharaoh and interprets the dream, I don't know if he comes up with the plan of, let me do some math here and figure out how all this will work, you know, but he's ready. He's ready to be an administrator now. He said years of preparation. And so when the opportunity comes, now he's been prepared. So I think that's helpful.
It does. And then we'll finish up in 39 and 40. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. And now this is a phrase that we've seen before in Potiphar. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders, and only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. And Joseph finally looks around and figures out, okay, this is what I've been working towards.
And he was never forgotten. He was being prepared.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's easy, as we look through this, to just look at Joseph as the forgotten guy and all that. But God certainly hadn't forgotten him. God's preparing him.
Yeah.
You know, for this task.
You know, like you've been talking about all along, which I think is brilliant, over in where it says God intended this for good. And not just for Joseph, not just for the 12 brothers, not even just for Egypt. But this is something that's going to affect the entire world. And so God is never going to forget his children, even the ones that walk away from him.
And in that respect, it's a foreshadowing, I think, of Christ.
Yeah.
Because through Joseph, God brings salvation to the world.
And the Son comes to the world that is starving so that they can have a feast.
Sold into slavery, or sold into, you know, by his own kin, his own brothers betray him. And
I think there's a lot of parallels. Well, that does it for this time. So we appreciate y'all joining us. We hope y'all are staying safe. We hope that everything is working out very, very well for you, and that it continues to do so that we can move past these 7 years of isolation and move back into some 7 years of prosperity.
Absolutely.
But be safe.
God bless.